It is Friday, June 12th, 2020. And June 12th happens to be both Philippine Independence Day and Loving Day. All right. So Philippine Independence Day is is mainly celebrated in the Philippines, but it's also something recognized by a lot of Filipino Americans. And the Loving Day celebrates the day that basically anti-miscegenation laws were struck down by the Supreme Court of the United States, right? Super, super important. So I wanted this video, this live situation is meant to be something to educate everyone, but specifically to talk to other Filipino Americans out there who might not necessarily understand or fully align themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, let me get things real clear, real fast. I believe that Black Lives Matter. I believe that until their lives matter to everyone, then nothing. I mean, like that is the fight we have to fight. I believe that the Filipinx and Filipinx American histories are intrinsically linked to Black history in the US. And without the events that transpired for Black folks, for the Black community, I wouldn't be here. A lot of other Filipinos wouldn't be here. So it's really important for us to align ourselves with the Black Lives Matter movement because it is part of our history. All right. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to comment them below. Hopefully I'll see them. Sometimes I don't see all the comments until like much later. So trying to figure all of that out. All right. Okay. So, this is going to be a little bit of a history lesson. Okay. There's and like a little bit of Filipinx history and Filipinx American history, and then how that intertwined with Black American history. All right. So let's backtrack even before America joined into the picture, right? Um, for about 333 years, the Philippines was occupied by Spain. All right. There was a lot of trade between between Manila and Acapulco in Mexico. So there was a lot of like um, traveling back and forth between with the Spanish galleon trade, right? Um, Trade of fruits, vegetables, all kinds of things, right? And people too, right? Um, the first Filipinos to set foot in North America arrived in Morro Bay, California. And in fact, Morro Bay is named after specifically those groups of Filipinos who landed there. Um, they were known kind of as the Moro tribe, right? Um, and they were really the first Asians to land in California. Now, that's not something that a lot of people really talk about, and I feel like that's one of those things with Filipinx history, um, is that we are really, really good at assimilating because we've been conditioned historically to do so, right? We were conditioned by the Spanish to try to blend in and be, kind of adapt the Spanish way of living. And then the Americans came along. I'll get to that in a second, right? So, um, so the first Filipinos to land in the U.S. were at Morro Bay in California, but the first permanent Filipino settlements actually in North America actually happened in Louisiana. It happened at St. Malo, Bayou St. Malo, in Louisiana, kind of close to New Orleans. 1763. I have notes written down because I'm not going to remember all these dates. But that was one of the first Filipino settlements. They basically jumped ship and landed there when one of the Spanish galleons landed there, and they were known as the Manila Men, and they started families with a lot of the Black and Creole folks who were living in that bayou. So St. Malo is there's still a neighborhood there, I believe. And interestingly enough, there's definitely a Filipino presence in New Orleans. There's some restaurants and things like that. So if you're in the area, go find them. Now, fast forward, right? Around 1896, the Philippines starts a revolution against Spain, all right? And interestingly enough, 1896 is also the same year that the U.S. legalized segregation. The whole separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson court case that, yeah, that deemed segregation to be legal. 1898, the U.S. decides that it wants to have a hand in what was happening in the Philippines, right? This was their opportunity, basically, to take over more parts of the world. They knew that Spain had other territories around the U.S., including Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the U.S. wanted it, right? Like a lot of people believed that this was the U.S.'s destiny, right? Otherwise known as manifest destiny. This is what everyone believed. It's like, this is what's supposed to happen. This is our destiny. We're supposed to take over the world, colonize everywhere and take over the world, right? So initially, the U.S. came to the Philippines in 1898 to join the Filipinos to fight against the Spanish. And they were there and they were just like, yeah, we're totally on your side. And then on June 12th, 1898, the Philippines declared independence from Spain, right? So that is why we celebrate June 12th as the Philippine independence, because it was our independence from Spain. Now, little did we know, we were all excited, we're like trying to build our own government. Little did we know that the US and Spain were going into an agreement, and they wrote up the Treaty of Paris, in which the US basically purchased the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam all in one package. And so the Philippines became a U.S. territory, along with Puerto Rico and Guam and Cuba. All right. Now, the Philippines was not happy about this. Like, we were like, we just gained independence. We are ready to try to do this on our own. And here you are trying to take over, right? And February 1899 to approximately June 1913 was the Philippine-American War, though Roosevelt declared the end of the Philippine-American War in 1902. But there were still little battles going on in different parts of the country, right? Now, here's the thing. The Philippines is 7,700 islands, I believe. And you know, we've been conglomerated into this country, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone spoke the same language, that everyone had the same beliefs, that even had the same customs, right? There's like over 100 languages, 100 dialects spoken in the Philippines. So, um, you know, some of the tribes were just kind of lumped in with the Philippines, not really by their choice, but here we are, right? Um, yes. So there was still a lot of fighting happening through 1913. All right. Um, Mainly in the South, the Southern tribes, the Moro tribes. All right. Um, and the U.S. essentially saw the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and Alaskan natives as like quote unquote savages, right? That they needed to save, all in the name of manifest destiny. Now, I'm going to show you a couple pictures from this amazing book called The Forbidden Book. Okay. The Forbidden Book is basically an account of what happened during the Philippine-American War. And it has all of these amazing pictures from that time that show pictures and mainly political cartoons that kind of show how people were feeling about what was happening across the world, you know, at the time. And let's see here. It was written together by Abe Ignacio, Enrique de la Cruz, George Emmanuel, and Helen Toribio. Right? This is actually my parents' book. I kind of stole it from them. They know I have it. They know I have it. So let's show you some pictures, right, of like how they viewed the Philippines. Some of the pictures might be a little disturbing, so take into account that I am showing you these images because I believe it's important for us to know that these exist, right? Because so often things are just swept under the rug, right? Like we all like to pretend that everything was peachy keen and that, you know, there weren't any issues and we're all one race, we're all one human race, and we don't see color. But this history really is really relevant. You know, and a lot of people like to say things like, oh well, you know, no one alive now owns slaves, or no one, you know, was enslaved, quote unquote, today. But there is such a thing as generational trauma, and that um, can can really impact people today. And not for nothing, the systems still exist that were built back in the day. So, anyways, all right. So this is McKinley, the Filipinos' first bath into civilization. And then in the background, you'll see Puerto Rico and Cuba being represented as well. All right, so there's going to be two images, but I'm going to try to show you the main image that I want to show. It's also from the cover of the book, but I'm going to show you the full image. A little bit bright because of the light, right? So you see Cuba and Puerto Rico back there. All right. Yeah. Oh yeah, they really, really, oops, they really felt that. They really felt that they were like cleansing us of our sins, or cleansing us of our like savage ways. Oh God, right? Like let's not even get into um I mean the whole like things that happened in the Philippines with the Spanish is like it's a whole nother life. All right. Now, here I thought this was such a great image to find because this is The Boston Sunday Globe, Sunday morning, March 5th, 1899. All right. It is a comic, and it is the Filipino before expansion and after expansion. And I want you to pay attention to the way that it is drawn, the way that the people are drawn, right? The way the Filipinos are drawn. Now, they're basing this after the Aeta and the Igorot tribes who, I mean, like, I am one version of Filipino, right? Like, we have Black Filipinos, and like they're the indigenous folks of our country, and it's unfortunate that so often they've been the ones who not only didn't necessarily want to become part of this nation, but they were the ones who were put on display. I mean, like, put on display. I mean, still treated to this day as though they are not um, citizens of the country, or that they have a say. You know, it's a whole other thing. Okay, so here is, whoop, hold on, make sure I don't drop the book. I mean, wait, hold on. Angles are hard. I mean, like, hello. You know, if you want pictures of these, I can certainly take a picture and send them to you. You can just let me know, you know. And that way I'll have an idea. I am not seeing anything on Facebook. So anyways, there's that. Okay. Now, now let's go more into how Black history played a role in Filipinx history, right? In July 1899, the first of 6,000 segregated regiments of Black soldiers, otherwise known as the Buffalo Soldiers, came to the Philippines to fight the Filipinos. They were, and like, if you know the history of Buffalo Soldiers real quick, like, one of the things that they were created for was to actually technically police the Native American population in the US, the Native Americans on the plains. So it's just a whole history of putting, you know, one minority group under after another minority group, right? So now there were um, there were certainly a mixture of people, mixture of folks within the Buffalo Soldier regiments who had different feelings about, you know, what was happening in the Philippines. Some of them felt that they did not want to be a part of this whole situation. They did not agree with it. Some of them felt like, okay, you know, like, maybe this is a way that we can help them. They've also believed that maybe they can, you know, help the Philippines become more civilized. You know, there's no one group is a monolith, right? Like, that's just how it is in general. But there were definitely people who were against the Philippine American War, which is what it became eventually once, you know, the after the Treaty of Paris and all that. It was known, if you look up Philippine American War, there'll be more information about that now, but it used to be called the Philippine Insurrection, which, like, is a very specific language, right? Like, that's how I learned about it in elementary school. I learned about it as the Philippine Insurrection, which essentially made it seem as though we, the Philippines, were the ones who were trying to start shit. But we certainly were not. We were just like, we just want to do our own thing. Like, let us be our own country, you know. But the U.S. wasn't having it because, you know, they wanted to take over and all that jazz, you know. Um, but okay, so here's something that I thought was really interesting, and part of the research that I learned is that there were leaflets being passed around to the Buffalo Soldiers from some of the Filipino guerrilla soldiers, because guerrilla warfare essentially started in the Spanish-American War, from the Philippines. And they distributed leaflets to essentially convince some of the Buffalo Soldiers to join their ranks. And that, trying to explain to them, like, you all are being weaponized by these white people. Like, join our ranks. And there were about a dozen-ish that defected, to join the Filipino soldiers. Now, one of those soldiers was Private David Fagan of the 24th Colored Infantry. All right. He was 23 years old. 23 years old. I don't know what you were doing when you were 23, but I was not that responsible. He defected and eventually was put in command of 150 Filipino fighters. Right? And this person did so much to help us survive during that time. He was considered a traitor by the U.S., and eventually a bounty was put on his head. Now, there are kind of conflicting stories as to how he perished. Either someone found him and presented his, this is extremely violent, presented his decomposing head to claim the bounty. Someone apparently did do that, but there are other accounts saying that he eventually took a local wife and lived happily ever after in the mountains, which I think is kind of interesting. I'm going to believe that that's what happened. Right? Now, after the war, Filipinos were essentially considered U.S. nationals, right? And that allowed them to travel between the U.S. and the Philippines to seek employment. A lot of the times they were mainly farm workers, and worked in the canneries in Washington State and Seattle, right? But they were also pensionados, which was kind of like their version of a student visa. They could come to the U.S. to attend school, and there were also people who enlisted in the Navy. Okay, and this, I think, was a very interesting portrayal of how people kind of thought about, like, the Filipinos of the time, in relation to the Black Americans that were in the U.S. All right, I'm going to show you another image here from this book. Do you see that? It's essentially like trading one dark-skinned person for another, is kind of how they looked at it. Isn't that wild? It's wild. And I really feel like that they, from the get-go, like, they wanted us to not get along. They wanted us to, I'm talking about they, meaning the U.S. white people, did not want us to get along, wanted to try to separate us, wanted to try to make it so that we weren't communicating with each other, because when you create that kind of separation, they're not going to talk and they're going to think they're enemies, right? That's brainwashing at its finest. And it's dangerous, super dangerous. Now, during the 1920s and 1930s, oh, actually, so speaking of the Navy, right, I found this pretty amazing image. I've seen this before, in some, like, Filipino American history classes, and so I went to look for this on the internet. But this is, they literally, like, they lumped us together, so that this is how they have basically believed to, like, treat other people of color, right? And that's, I mean, like, hello. So I even have to keep going. I'll keep going because I will. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, right, this is when there's a lot of the Filipino folks coming into the U.S. There's all of this discrimination that's happening. And there were only specific people that were allowed to come to the U.S., right? People who could be employed. A lot of the times, they were, as far as the Filipino folks who were coming to the U.S., they were mainly men, young men who could work, who could do the like field work, could work really long hours in a cannery, you know, and they are affectionately known as the manongs. And the manongs, oh, man, they paved the way for so many of us. But they, you know, were young men and they needed to seek companionship. And who would they find companionship with if there weren't any Filipino women? Well, they found companionship with white women. And guess what? People did not like it. People hated it. You know, this is how they felt about it. Get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn this town down. That's how they felt about that, right? There were several anti-Filipino riots, in fact, that occurred. Some in Washington State, but famously there is the Watsonville riots of the Philippines. Oh, I feel like I'm missing a page here. Nope, I'm not missing a page. Yes, the Watsonville riots in California, Watsonville, California. And that started literally because they were unhappy. They found a Filipino farm worker with a white woman in his bed. I believe he wasn't even in the bed. You know, to blow off steam after long days, they would go to these dance halls. Oh my gosh, like these dance halls were like so major in the 1920s and 1930s, you know. That's how they relaxed. And it wasn't just Filipino folks going to these dance halls, like these white people were going there too, you know. But that was not allowed at all. So in 1933, the Supreme Court of California found in Roldan versus Los Angeles County that the existing anti-miscegenation laws were specifically between white people and quote-unquote mongoloids. And they found that Filipinos weren't considered part of the mongoloid race. They were considered part of the Malay race, or Malay race. So the California lawmakers fixed that section, fixed that law, and amended it to prohibit specifically marriage between white persons and members of the Malay race. All right. Now, most anti-miscegenation laws were essentially built or written so that white folks weren't muddying their bloodline, right? That they were keeping everything pure, right? If you've never heard of the word eugenics, I definitely recommend that you look into that, because the history of eugenics is the history of the US, right? And in fact, some of those laws, those old laws in the 1920s and 1930s, some of those laws, a certain Adolf Hitler actually really admired. And he took some of them and ran with it. So you know, those of you who like to pretend, mainly white folks who like to pretend that, you know, they didn't have a hand in this. History tells a lot, right? Now, fast forward a little bit. 1934 was the Philippine Independence Act, which basically started the process of independence of the Philippines from the US, right? But then World War II happened. And they were like, oh, just kidding, just kidding. Y'all can't leave yet because we need your territory to fight the Japanese. Now, the Japanese ended up occupying the Philippines as well for some time. That's a whole nother live, that whole situation. But they use the U.S. used the Philippines kind of as a base, and eventually had to free the Philippines from Japanese rule. So and in the midst of all this, there were a bunch of Filipino soldiers who were part of the Navy, the Army, who were fighting on behalf of the U.S. And it's taken almost their entire lifetime for them to be recognized as veterans, as U.S. veterans. They were finally, I believe it was 2015, 2017, one of those numbers, that the U.S. finally recognized these Filipino soldiers as being veterans of World War II. That's again a whole nother life, right? Now, 1965. Very important year in U.S. history and in Philippine history. This is when Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. All right. This was approved by, signed into law under Lyndon B. Johnson. For those of you who don't know, Lyndon B. Johnson was a racist. Oh boy, he was very racist. And like that might make it seem like, oh, but he wrote this immigration law, like this is when it happened, like he's gonna claim to fame this really important piece of history. But I'm gonna get into why it's a little bit like, interesting, Lyndon B. Johnson. Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. It ended the cap on non-Northern European immigrants because there was a cap at one point. Okay, it gave preference to relatives of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents, as well as people who had specialized skills and professionals, right? So very, very specific type of people are allowed to come into the country now, all right? There's a whole, Andrew picked up the phone. I think he has to go get our food. Oh no, we got food delivered. Yay! It's almost dinner time for us. So you're going to see him pass through. Okay, so back on track, right? The whole professionalism thing, right? This is around the time when there were a lot of folks being trained to be medical professionals as well in the Philippines, to then eventually come into the U.S. And all that jazz. But right, if we backtrack to what I was talking about earlier about how, there was a lot of like molding of the Filipino people so that they are civilized, so that they are upstanding citizens for the U.S. That kind of adds on to the whole myth of the model minority, right? Like, let's think about that for a second, right? The model minority myth essentially, is this whole idea in which it was tacked on mainly to like Asian populations, in the US, where they were taught that, or they were told that, like, okay, you know, because you have value, you have a skill, you are a professional, then you are allowed to enter into this country because you are contributing and all that jazz, right? But think about that. Think about that language. That is subversive shit, because that is playing into the psyche of the Asian and Filipinx population of immigrants who have come into this country and now believe, oh, I have value, I have skill, this is why I deserve to be here, you know. And that essentially is meant to create a divide between the Black folks in the US, the Black communities, and other minority groups, right? Because they remember this history. They have these cartoons to remind you of that history, right? But they're not telling us about it. And they essentially, I mean, if you read the language of all of it, it's clear that they are trying to create a divide. It's real clear, real clear. And that's, and here's another point as to, like, how I know that they were trying to be subversive towards the Black community and trying to pit those of us who are immigrants against the people of color who are already living in this country. You know what else was happening in 1965? The civil rights movement. Like, all of that is happening, and then you're telling me that the president's like, oh yeah, let's let these other, like, non-white people into the country to make them look like they're upstanding citizens. That's sneaky shit. It's sneaky, it's subversive, and it's racist, right? Now, 1965 also happens to be the year of the Delano grape strikes, for those of you who are familiar with that. Major history in Filipino-American history, or major piece of Filipino-American history, I should say, that unfortunately has been overshadowed with Cesar Chavez and that history. But Filipinos played such an important role in all of that as well, right? This is a really grainy image. You're not necessarily going to see it very well, but this is a famous photo. I actually would love to get this as a poster, honestly. But on the stairwell, it says, positively no Filipinos allowed. So, you know how people think about that. Now, 1967, super important year. This was the year of Loving v. Virginia, which is the Supreme Court case that struck down anti-miscegenation laws and essentially allowed interracial marriages. Now, in general, they, again, were mainly meant to keep the white race pure, keep the white bloodline pure. But I believe that they also really didn't recognize marriages between people of color of different groups either, or they really just kind of ignored it and were like, yeah, whatever, because they all kind of lumped us all together anyway as, like, savages of different, I don't know, different levels of savages, quote unquote, right? But for those of you who don't know, and those of you who are like, why are we still talking about this? It's been such a long time. This is so important because the laws were still in so many states' books. The anti-miscegenation laws were still in so many of the books of different states. In fact, the year 2000 finally was when the last anti-miscegenation law was voted out in Alabama. So what, 20 years ago? It in the history of history, in the history of the US, it was not that long ago. And I think it's so important for us to remember that, that it wasn't that long ago at all, right? And so there is so much connection between the US, or the US, the Black community and the Filipinx communities, right? I highly recommend that you check out this book if you can find it. I don't know if it's still in print. It might still be in print. But there's like a whole section of historical dates and events in the back that go into, months and days and years and things like that. And in this time where it kind of feels like there is a reckoning, right? Like we can no longer ignore the importance of Black lives mattering. Andrew, you can pass through. We got pizza for dinner. So in this time where it's becoming more of a daily conversation, more and more people are learning about what's happening. It's really important for those of us who have, even as a person of color, we have our own privileges, right? Like, and we also, every single one of us plays into, or should really examine how we have played into white supremacy. And so how can you do that if you're not aware of your own history, right? This is why I wanted to kind of go through this. And honestly, June 12th felt like the most perfect day to do it, considering that it was both Philippine Independence Day and Loving Day. I mean, there's so much, like, I don't know how many of y'all out there got any Philippine American relation history lessons in school. You had to seek it out, and mainly in college, if you learned anything. So it's it's so important to have that history on hand, and to really like learn about what's going on, and how it all relates to what's happening now. So that's basically it. That's basically it. I just want to, encourage other Filipinx folks to learn about our history, to learn about how we can do better for the Black community, to help raise, their voices and the issues that matter to them, because the work that they did in U.S. history, the work that they're continuing to do, will affect how we continue to survive in this country as well, right? Yeah. And lastly, if it wasn't for Loving v. Virginia, Andrew and I would not be a possibility, right? He's not listening. Oh, he's not. He's listening to something else. But Andrew and I wouldn't be a possibility. Soul wouldn't be a possibility. Or even if he was, like, he would be illegal. Could you imagine that? Oh, God, I can't even imagine that. I'm gonna cry. So this is why this is important. This is why it was important to me. I know this is longer than I anticipated. And I'm sorry if I missed any comments. But thank you for hanging out with me and for being part of this little history lesson. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them as they come along. But otherwise, thank you all for joining me. Have a wonderful Friday night. Happy Philippine Independence Day and happy Loving Day.